Yeah, there's a kid in Dakota City who flies around on a trash can lid, cracks jokes about his own outfit, and somehow ends up in one of the most quietly important pieces of writing in the history of superhero television. I'm talking about Virgil Hawkins, Static Shock. And I think most people who grew up watching this show remember it the same way. A fun Saturday morning cartoon about a kid with electric powers who fights weird villains with dumb names. That's the whole memory. Fun show, cool powers, nostalgia, done. But that's not actually why this character matters. And it's definitely not why the writing behind him holds up better than almost anything else airing at the same time, animated or not. Because underneath the trash can lid and the one-liners, Static was built to do something no other superhero on television was doing in the year 2000, and the show never once let you forget it, even while it was making you laugh. I've broken down why this character works into 3 stages, starting with the fact that Static almost didn't get made at all. To understand why Static is written so well, you have to understand why he exists in the first place. And that starts almost a decade before the cartoon, with a comic book industry that had a very specific blind spot. Black characters existed, sure, but they were almost always sidekicks, background players, or reduced to a single trait. So they started their own imprint, Milestone Media, built entirely around telling stories where characters of color weren't the exception in the room, they were the whole room. Static was one of the characters that came out of that. And here's the detail I think people skip past too quickly. Virgil Hawkins wasn't designed to be a statement first and a character second. McDuffie was very deliberate about that. He wanted a kid who worried about money, about getting picked on, about grades, who just happened to also be dealing with newly acquired electromagnetic powers. The blackness of the character wasn't a marketing angle. It was just what happens when you write a character from a specific lived point of view instead of retrofitting one. On the surface, that seems like a small distinction, but pay attention because this is where the writing starts revealing itself. Virgil isn't Spider-Man with different skin. He's not a diversity reskin of an existing archetype. His neighborhood, Paris Island, is poor and struggling on purpose, not as scenery, but because the show wants you to understand exactly what kind of world produced this kid. His powers don't come from a lab accident or a radioactive spider. They come from the Big Bang, a gang altercation that goes wrong when police use an experimental tear gas on a crowd that includes kids who had nothing to do with the fight. Virgil gets his powers because he was standing in the wrong place during a moment of violence that had nothing to do with him. That's not an accident. That's the show telling you in its very first 10 minutes that Static's world runs on the same gravity as the real one. Gang violence, disinvestment, policing gone wrong, these aren't going to be background noise for a superhero show about a kid slinging lightning bolts. They're going to be the foundation. And I think that's the first thing that separates Static from almost every other animated hero on air at the time. Most shows treat the origin as a formality, something to get through before the real fun starts. Static's origin is the thesis statement for the entire series. There's another layer to this that's easy to miss if you're not paying attention to who was actually in the room making the show. Dwayne McDuffie didn't just create the character and hand him off to a studio. He stayed involved as a writer and story editor on the animated series itself, working alongside a team that kept pulling from Milestone's original ethos even as the character moved from comic shelves to Saturday morning television. That continuity matters more than people give it credit for. A lot of adaptations lose the specificity of a character the second a new set of hands takes over. Static kept his voice because the person who built that voice never actually left the building. And then there's Virgil's family, which the show treats with a level of care you almost never see given to a superhero's home life. Robert Hawkins isn't an absent dad, and he isn't a plot device who exists purely to be lied to. He's a former Marine, a counselor at the community center, present and sharp enough that Virgil actually has to work to keep his secret from him. His older sister Sharon volunteers at that same center. This is a family that was already trying to hold their neighborhood together before Virgil ever put on a costume. Static becomes an extension of something the Hawkins family was already doing, not a departure from it. I think that's the quiet genius hiding in stage 1 that people don't talk about enough. The show didn't need a tragic dead parent to motivate its hero the way half of the genre does. It gave him a living, functioning support system and let the neighborhood itself, Paris Island, the Big Bang, the gang violence baked into his origin, provide the stakes instead. Stage 2, the tightrope. Here's where it gets genuinely impressive though, because a show that only did the heavy stuff, poverty, gang violence, racism, would get exhausting fast, especially for a Saturday morning audience. And a show that only did jokes and Monster of the Week fights would waste everything set up in that origin. Static Shock somehow does both in the same episode episode, constantly, and it never feels like whiplash. Virgil is funny, genuinely, consistently funny, quick with a comic book reference, self-deprecating about his own costume, more interested in girls and grades most of the time than being a hero. His best friend Richie is right there with him, and their dynamic is pure teenage energy, closer to a buddy comedy than a superhero drama. That's not incidental. That's the show buying trust with its audience. It wants you comfortable, laughing, invested in a hangout dynamic before it ever asks you to sit with something heavier. And then, without changing tone or format, it does exactly that. Take Sons of the Fathers. On the surface, it's a sleepover episode. Virgil wants to hang out at Richie's place, but the show uses that setup to reveal that Richie's father is quietly, deeply racist and has been shaping how Richie sees the world without Richie even fully realizing it. The episode never turns into an after-school special lecture. It just lets Virgil's father, Robert Hawkins, look Sean Foley dead in the eye and tell him exactly what his ignorance is costing him, his own son. No supervillain fight resolves that conflict. No electric blast fixes it. The show trusts a 22-minute cartoon to sit with something that doesn't have a clean ending, because that's how the world actually works. I think what's most impressive is that the show does this over and over, with a different issue every time, and somehow never repeats itself emotionally. Frozen Out is about a homeless former hero and mental illness. Where the Rubber Meets the Road tackles dyslexia through one of Virgil's own friends. Each time, Static's powers become almost irrelevant to solving the actual problem. He can stop a mugging, he can't fix a father's prejudice, or a kid's home life, or an illness. And the show is smart enough to know the difference. That's the complication most people miss when they remember this as just a fun show. It's not soft because it's for kids. It's disciplined because it's for kids. Every one of those episodes had to earn the trust of a young audience without lecturing them, without losing the humor that made them tune in, and without ever pretending a superhero could punch his way out of systemic problems. Part of why that balance actually lands is the voice work underneath it. Phil LaMarr plays Virgil with this constant, restless energy. He can deliver a joke about his own costume, and then 2 lines later, land a moment of real fear or grief without the tone ever feeling like it snapped. That's not a small thing to ask of a voice actor working in Saturday morning animation, where the temptation is always to flatten a character into one register so kids can read them instantly. Static was never allowed to be flattened. He's allowed to be scared and funny in the same breath, because that's closer to how actual teenagers process the world. And the villains matter here too, even though they rarely get the credit. Static's rogues gallery isn't just monster of the week filler. Most of them are other bang babies, other kids from Virgil's own neighborhood who got hit by the same gas in the same riot and made different choices with what it gave them. Hotstreak, Talon, they're not evil outsiders invading Dakota City. They're Virgil's classmates, his almost friends, the version of his own story that could have gone a different way. That's the show quietly reinforcing its own thesis one more time. The real danger was never really the powers. It was always the neighborhood and what it does or doesn't give a kid to hold on to. Which brings us to the episode where all of that groundwork pays off completely. Stage 3, the episode that proves everything. The episode is called Jimmy, and if you've seen it, you already know why I saved it for last. Jimmy Osgood is one of Virgil's classmates. Not a villain, not a bang baby, just a regular kid who gets bullied relentlessly and has no idea how to process it. Virgil tries to reach out to him, doesn't quite know how to help way that actual teenagers try to reach out to each other, and it isn't enough. Jimmy finds his father's gun, and by the end of the episode, he's brought it to school. This episode aired in the immediate aftermath of Columbine, and everyone working on it knew exactly what they were doing. The show's director has talked about how directly Columbine shaped this specific episode, and it shows in every choice they made. There's no supervillain here. Static doesn't swoop in to save the day with a lightning bolt. The threat isn't a monster of the week. It's a kid who felt invisible for long enough that violence started to look like the only language anyone would listen to. And here's the detail that I think is the smartest writing decision in the entire series. The episode ends by breaking format entirely. It steps outside the story and speaks directly to the audience about gun violence in American schools, with real numbers, no cartoon softness around it. Think about what that actually required. A network cartoon built to sell toys and Saturday morning ad slots, using its platform to talk to kids about something adults were still struggling to talk about, honestly. That's not a show cashing in on a serious issue for prestige points. That's a show that had spent an entire season, building the exact kind of trust with its audience that made this moment land instead of feeling like an ambush. And it only works because of everything Stage 2 set up. If Static had been a joke-only show, this episode would have felt like tonal betrayal. If it had been a message-only show, nobody would have stuck around long enough to watch it. The show needed Virgil the class clown, Virgil the nerd, Virgil the kid who complains about his suit, in order to make Virgil the kid staring at a friend who brought a gun to school actually hit as hard as it did. I think what gets me most, rewatching it now, is how small the episode keeps Virgil's failure. He doesn't miss some obvious warning sign through carelessness. He reaches out the way a 15-year-old actually reaches out. A little late, a little awkward, not quite sure what to say, and it still isn't enough. The show doesn't punish him for that by making him responsible for what happens. It just lets the moment sit there, uncomfortable, the way it would in real life. No neat lesson about what Virgil should have done differently, just the plain fact that sometimes trying isn't the same as succeeding, and a good friend and a superhero are still, in the end, only one teenager. That's the whole formula of the show in one sentence, honestly. Earn the laugh, so the gut punch means something, never the other way around. And it's worth saying, the character didn't stop mattering once the show ended. Static went on to appear in Justice League Unlimited, standing shoulder to shoulder with Superman and Batman as a full member of the League's roster, a kid from Dakota City who earned his place next to the biggest names in the DC universe. Milestone Media, the imprint that created him, eventually folded as a comics publisher, but Static kept going precisely because the writing behind him was strong enough to outlive the company that built him. That doesn't happen by accident. It's also worth remembering what that crossover actually meant at the time. This wasn't a guest cameo played for a nostalgia pop. Static was folded into the DC animated universe as a genuine equal, fighting alongside characters that had decades of publishing history behind them, while he'd only existed for a few years. The showrunners could have treated him as a novelty. Instead, they treated him the exact same way Milestone always intended him to be treated from the very beginning, as a hero who belonged in the room, not one who was let into it. And that, I think, is really the through line connecting all three of these stages. Static was never written to prove a point about representation. He was written like every other detail mattered just as much as it would for any other hero. His home life, his neighborhood, his sense of humor, his fear, his failures. The show never once treated getting that right as optional. So when I say Static is the best written black superhero in TV history, I don't mean that as a nostalgia trophy. I mean the writers behind this show did something genuinely difficult. They built a hero whose humanity came first, whose humor was real, whose world had weight, and who never once needed his powers to be the point. Virgil Hawkins mattered before he could shoot lightning out of his hands, and the show never let you forget that. I think that's actually the highest compliment you can pay a piece of writing. Take away the powers, and you still have a character worth watching. If you want more from the world of Milestone and the DC animated universe, you're going to want to check out the next video. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.